Good evening and welcome to St. George's House in Conversation. I'm delighted that so many of you are able to be with us again online this evening. And thank you to those of you who have sent in some questions for our guest tonight. It's a great pleasure to welcome back to St. George's House Sir David Omand, who has been part of consultations here and who also served as a trustee of Windsor Leadership. Now, Sir David, as many of you know, was the first UK Security and Intelligence Coordinator responsible to the Prime Minister for the professional health of the intelligence community, national counter-terrorism strategy, and indeed homeland security. He served for 7 years on the Joint Intelligence Committee. He was Permanent Secretary of the Home Office from 1997 to 2000, and before that was Director of GCHQ. He is also the author of numerous books, most recently the splendidly jacketed How Spies Think, which I hope you can see behind me. Sir David, thank you for making the time to be with us. And there's a moment in your book where you remember the summer of 1968. It's mid-August, and you and some university friends are driving an old Land Rover on the Hungarian side of the border with Czechoslovakia. You're on your way to Turkey, and your Land Rover has to dodge in and out of a column of Soviet tank transporters on that same border. So the invasion of Czechoslovakia is imminent. You didn't know that. The Joint Intelligence Committee in London didn't know it. But it is just one instance of you being up close to hugely significant global events. And we'll come to others. But I wanted to ask you just about the route into security work and what drew you to the career you have so successfully pursued.
Well, thank you, Gary, for the introduction, and indeed, thanks for the invitation to have this conversation. Truth is, I graduated in 1969 from Cambridge. I had a double first in economics, and Her Majesty's Treasury were very kind and said, come and have a placement. So I went into the Treasury, and it took me really not very long at all to decide that a career as an economic advisor in the Treasury was not really what I wanted to do. I had a research proposal to lead to a doctorate. Who knows? It's one of those counterfactuals. I've no idea whether my proposal for rather abstruse piece of mathematical modeling might have led somewhere, or perhaps not. Who knows? But instead I said, I better get a job. And I looked around and I found this mysterious organization called GCHQ. Nobody would talk about it. And discovered they recruited a small number of graduates every year. To be honest, what convinced me was the difficulty of the entrance exam, which they set for those who wanted to join. And before you had to pass this, before they would admit you, before they'd admit to you that you were actually going to join an intelligence agency. If anyone's interested, specimen GCHQ entrance exam papers from that era are now published by Penguin in the second volume of the GCHQ puzzle book. If anyone tries them, I guarantee they will be as mystified by these exam questions as I was. But I did pursue the application and I joined GCHQ in September that year. And it was 25 years later when the major government legislated for GCHQ and for the MI6 and admitted to their roles. I mean, subsequently, I worked in the Ministry of Defence in London. In the 1980s, I was Principal Private Secretary to the Secretary of State. In the mid-90s, I was the Deputy Under Secretary of State for Policy. And that was when I was invited by Douglas Hurst, who was Foreign Secretary, to go back to GCHQ as director. That announcement, incidentally, was reported in the newspapers. And that's when my aunt contacted me and said she thought she could now tell me where she'd spent the war, which was at Bletchley Park, a Wren officer and a German speaker. And indeed, she had a medal to show for it. But she'd never told the family where she'd spent the war. It was just on war work in England. Such was the secrecy surrounding that whole activity. But I went back, as I say, in the mid-90s as director. It was a very exciting time. The Cold War was over. The organization was pivoting towards new targets like counterterrorism and serious crime. And over the horizon, you could see coming this digital revolution that was going to lead to, clearly, to radical reform. So not least, that led me to persuade the Chief Secretary to the Treasury to allow me to run a public-private partnership to raise the funds from the city to rebuild the department. And that's what you see today as you drive through Cheltenham, you see the iconic donut building. But, and that indeed meant that we started our reforms before our great partners, the National Security Agency in the United States. I had to leave my successors to complete these ambitious plans, since I then got headhunted to be the permanent secretary of the Home Office, as you mentioned, working for Jack Straw. I wouldn't change any part of my career. It's been enormous fun.
Well, what a wonderful story about your aunt. So we could almost say it was in the genes, this kind of work. Now, in your book, your recent book, How Spies Think, you suggest that the frameworks used by British intelligence can be applied much more widely. And you call the relevant model SEES, S-E-E-S. And the historical event you preface that model with is the Falklands War. And I wonder if maybe you would remind us of the intelligence lead-in to that war, and then say something about the SEES model.
Yeah, sure. My definition of the purpose of intelligence is that it leads to better decisions by reducing the ignorance of the decision taker. And that could be any of us, it could be governments, it could be military commanders. In evolutionary terms, using our intelligence gave our species a survival advantage. Those who used their intelligence lived to pass on their genes. And this, in a sense, is still true for us today. So I thought about this and thought, well, there are four kinds of output that you can use to reduce your ignorance of what you're facing, and whether it's which way to vote or where to live, or if you're a minister, whether to commit the armed forces. These four outputs make up this acronym that I came up with, SEES, S-E-E-S, situational awareness, explanation, estimation, and finally strategic notice. Now, the example you mentioned, I opened the book with it. This was the moment in March 1982. I was working with my boss, Defence Secretary John Nott, in the House of Commons on a speech he was going to give. And an officer arrived with a locked pouch, and it contained 3 GCHQ decrypted intercepts of Argentine naval communications. I may say I'm not giving away a secret here. This is in the official history of the campaign. But these reports, there were 3 of them, provided what I call situational awareness. This is facts on the ground. The Argentine fleet has left port. There is a senior military officer on board. Having started my career at GCHQ, the explanation seemed to me all too clear. It was an unexpected Argentine invasion that was underway. The estimate of how events would unfold was also pretty clear. Given the distance to the Falkland Islands, the islands would be invaded by the end of the week. And John and I looked at each other. The Prime Minister must be told at once. So we rushed down the corridor, and thankfully she was in her office in the House of Commons, and we burst in. And I showed her these 3 key GCHQ intercepts. The invasion was inevitable. There was only a company of Royal Marines on the islands. there was simply not enough time for any naval reinforcements to reach the Falklands 8,000 miles away. And in the extraordinary meeting that followed in her room, the decision was taken to send a naval task force to the South Atlantic. I will not forget telephoning the duty commander in the Ministry of Defence from her room to pass on the historic order, ready the fleet for sea. Now, when you think about it, showing resolve by having the task force announcement ready when the fact of the invasion became public, it saved her government. It was a rare case when a few secret intelligence reports provide sufficient situational awareness, powerful explanation, and a pretty solid estimate of how things are going to unfold. Tragically, the final S in C's stands for strategic notice. And that's the bit the government had got badly wrong. The Joint Intelligence Committee had warned the government that if the Argentine junta came to the conclusion that the negotiations that were going on weren't going to lead anywhere, they'd take matters into their own hands. But the British government, interesting question of interpretation. The interpretation was that since we were negotiating in good faith, albeit slowly, there was no need to worry. And worse, in an exercise of magical thinking that was never made explicit to the intelligence community, the government just assumed they would receive sufficient warning from intelligence to be able to send reinforcements. So they didn't afford the investment that might have deterred the Argentine junta. For example, they could have extended the runway. Eventually, of course, that's what they did after the war. And worse, they'd announced the scrapping of the only naval vessel in the region, HMS Endurance, the ice patrol ship. There's an interesting account in the new authorized history of GCHQ that's just been published by Professor John Ferris. And he concludes that actually, although at the time it was seen as an intelligence failure, it wasn't. It was a policy failure. And the subsequent recapture of the islands was actually a huge intelligence success, since GCHQ could decipher the Argentine signals and provide the task force of warning in advance of what the junta was doing, including, I may say, the junta's decision to open active hostilities by ordering a two-pronged attack on the task force. And it was knowledge of that by the Prime Minister and the War Cabinet that led to the changing of the rules of engagement and the sinking of the cruiser Belgrano. So a very dramatic event, but you get the idea, I hope, that situational awareness is answering questions that start with what, when, and where, before you start arguing about what to do about it. And here, I think we do all need the humility to recognize what I describe as the first lesson of intelligence, which is our knowledge of the world is always fragmentary, incomplete, and sadly is sometimes wrong. But the second lesson in intelligence, which I think is worth just pausing on, is that even if you've got well-attested facts, they need explaining. Facts are capable of multiple interpretation. Every defense lawyer knows this. Was the reason the accused fingerprints were on the fragments of a petrol bomb thrown at the police because he threw it? Or was it just his old bottle that he'd thrown out that the mob picked up as they rushed past? The defense barrister will give one narrative and the prosecution will give another. So explanation is really, really important. And the problem there is that all of us unconsciously like to choose explanations that fit our preconceptions. And this is where a lot of the error tends to creep in. But if you've got a sound explanation, then you can move on to the third letter, the second E, estimation. By the way, I try and avoid, I may slip into it in this conversation, but I try and avoid the word predict. Nobody has a crystal ball. The future is unknowable, but you can estimate. If you've got a good explanation, you can produce a decent estimate of the kind of range of what might happen what might, and that's what we see with COVID, of course, the modeling. And that's the next thing you can get to, because if you've got a good explanation and some estimates, you can start to model on different assumptions. If we open the schools, what's going to happen to the R number, those sort of questions. And then finally, of course, it's strategic notice, as I mentioned, the future challenges. And if you look ahead, well ahead, then there may well be things you can do. As individuals, it might be insurance. You know, chances of your house burning down is very low, but you can insure against that. If you're a government, you've got to keep an eye to what is the next big shock that might come. And then you can invest. And we discovered when COVID-19 hit us that there'd been great investment in UK biosecurity, so vaccines could be produced quickly, but there wasn't a big stockpile of protective equipment, certainly not enough for care homes and medical staff, which again is a failure of strategic notice.
Okay, and when you came to write this book, I read in a previous interview that part of the inspiration for it was both Brexit and the 2016 US election. So what was it about that made you think, yes, I will write this particular book?
Yeah, well, I certainly didn't write the book as a memoir, though it's got a few anecdotes in it. I wrote it as a call to arms because I was angry at the way the Brexit referendum and then the 2016 presidential election were clearly being reflected in social media in very deceptive ways. What I saw was a rising tide of half-truths and distortions, people being persuaded online of what they ought to think and want. There were some downright falsehoods, some deceptions, and not just coming from Russia, aimed at widening divisions in society and basically setting us at each other's throats. And thinking about the way that emotion, we were being invited to use our emotions, not our reason, it led me to reflect that whenever you have a big decision to take, there are two kinds of thinking that have to come together inside your head, inside a single mind. On the one hand, your desires for what you want to achieve by making a decision or by choice, or perhaps it's your fears of what you want to avoid by your decision. And on the other hand, I hope, rational analysis of the situation and the options that are open to you. I mean, both are necessary. You need the values-driven what ought to be, but you also need the dispassionate what is, and they need to be integrated if you're going to make sound decisions. And bringing those together has always been hard, but the theme of the book is that in the internet age, when so much of the information you come across is deceptive in one way or another, it is getting harder. The emotional side is too dominant. One of my lessons in intelligence is that it's our own demons that are most likely to mislead us. We don't realize we're being manipulated by the emotional impact of the material that's presented. And that's one of the things that leads government into falling into the trap of magical thinking. For example, announcing the ends of policy, what you're trying to achieve by the policy, announced with a great fanfare, targets are set, you get the right kind of emotional punch, but you haven't done the thinking through the ways and means of how you're actually going to deliver it. And you can think of some examples, indeed recent examples from the COVID experience.
Of course. And we will come back to the whole business of the internet and its impact. But I wonder if I could turn just for a moment. You mentioned the Falklands incident as an intelligence success, but you write very compellingly in your book about the Iraq invasion 2003 and the infamous weapons of mass destruction. And you write terrifically about the intelligence failures there. And I wonder if you might just take us through a little bit of that and indeed the lesson that should be taken from it.
Let me hasten to reassure those who haven't read the book that there are intelligence successes in the book as well, although public discussion tends to be about failures, partly because if you have a success, you don't want it talked about because you may want to repeat it. So there's a bit of a bias then. But no, there were intelligence failures. Robin Butler in his report, and then John Chilcott in his big inquiry, uncovered really the way in which the intelligence community in the UK and in the United States misled themselves. And if you think about it in terms of what I've just been talking about, the SEAS model, all four of those key outputs that the intelligence community was giving ministers, all four of them had problems. Strategic notice had been lacking. Nobody had any idea that the United States was going to move so decisively towards toppling Saddam, a year after 9/11. So Iraq hadn't been a high priority for intelligence gathering. So the sort of basic facts on the ground were pretty few and far between. And that affected our situational awareness. The few intelligence sources there were, amongst them was a defector, an Iraqi defector, codenamed Curveball, who fabricated intelligence about biological warfare production that made its way, into Parliament, into the public discourse. He was in the hands of the German Secret Service, and British and American analysts were never allowed to talk to him. He was a chemical engineer, and he had, crucially, worked on Saddam's biological warfare program. So when he started to produce reports that were shared with us about resumption of production of biological warfare agents and a mobile biological warfare factory, it was all too convincing. After the war, he admitted he'd made it up because he wanted Saddam overthrown. He wanted the Americans to invade. But his deceptive reporting formed a crucial part of Colin Powell's presentation to the United Nations Security Council on the case for war. The explanation, the second letter of C's, of what all the intelligence meant was also defective because of in a sense, a groupthink, an overriding assumption that Saddam would be bound to be hiding whatever he was doing. So even if you didn't find anything, that didn't prove anything because he would be hiding it. And that's why the delays in the UN inspectors finding anything was put down to deception. The estimates of his capability therefore turned out to be wrong. He was in breach of his UN obligations on his missile programs, and his nuclear ambitions were properly assessed. But in terms of the overall picture, it was a perfect storm on each of the four categories of C's. What was missed really was what Saddam confessed to after he was captured. He had ordered his WMD programs to be halted so that sanctions would be lifted, international sanctions would be lifted. I've no doubt he would have resumed them. But crucially, he had told very few people in Iraq of his decision because he still wanted Iran to believe he still had them. So not surprisingly, the sort of intelligence that was available was very often from people in Iraq who weren't aware that the programs had been suspended. So back to that first lesson that I mentioned, knowledge is fragmentary, it's incomplete, and sadly, it is sometimes wrong.
Of course. Now, coming back to the internet and such things, you've witnessed huge changes in the intelligence and security world. I mean, we've come a long way from George Smiley, and not least in the realm of technology. How prepared are we in this country for cyber warfare?
It's a very good question, but let me preface my answer by reassuring people that the George Smileys still exist. Indeed, one of the case studies I put in the book is Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB officer who became a key MI6 agent and indeed rose to be head of the Residentura, the KGB operation in the London embassy. So I recount how he, when Margaret Thatcher met Gorbachev for the first time, Gordievsky had not only written the official brief for Gorbachev, but he'd written large chunks of the brief for Margaret Thatcher, because he was working for MI6. So no wonder the visit was such a success. But the point you make about the cyber domain is absolutely right. My old department, GCHQ, now has this huge responsibility of the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is in a nice office block just opposite Victoria Station. And it's a very open environment so that businesses can go in there and discuss their security issues and protection issues. So it's very far from the barbed wire and barricades you would find around GCHQ headquarters in Cheltenham. It's a vital part of GCHQ. The present government announced only a couple of weeks ago that GCHQ and the Ministry of Defence are forming a national cyber force, sort of joint force, to be able to conduct offensive cyber operations when they're necessary. And we now know officially that GCHQ conducted such operations against the so-called Islamic State in Syria and Iraq and helped to contain that threat. But the range of cyber threats that we face is quite wide. I have another, Gary, I've got another acronym. I keep inventing these. This one is CESPIT, which, you need to remember CESPIT, which is crime, espionage, sabotage and subversion, perverting internet technology.
Right, okay.
And each of those, crime, I mean, this is where criminals go to make money these days, is in the cyber world. The espionage, we've just had this massive SolarWinds attack on the United States by Russia. Sabotage, we have not seen the potential for sabotage other than in a small number of cases. But what we have seen is sabotage by accident, so that the Russians launched this NotPetya attack to try and intimidate some Ukrainian companies by putting it in accounting software that they used, but it escaped. And they hadn't realized that it would then spread around the world. I think the last count was something like $10 billion worth of damages. And it almost destroyed the world's largest shipping company, Maersk. So and then the final S, which we're just waking up to, is subversion. I call it subversion, old-fashioned subversion, but it's just done digitally. And this is the fake news and the automated bots that are amplifying fake news, everything that we saw in the 2016 election, and indeed even in the French presidential election, where they hacked into the Macron's email stream and then pushed them out into the public domain. So that sort of use of cyber for subversion is something we've really got to get used to and start doing something about.
And where do you see, you mentioned Russia, but where do you see the greatest threats coming from?
It's always dangerous to predict that word again, because we don't really know. But the countries that have real capability to cause us difficulty are Russia and China, Iran and North Korea. And you might say, North Korea, what's that got to do with us? Well, they launched the WannaCry attack in 2017. And that was the attack that tied up the National Health Service, sort of ransomware attack, so that so much of their machinery was blocked. Now, just imagine if that kind of attack had taken place a month or two back, when the National Health Service was at maximum stretch for COVID-19, and suddenly you discover that the scanners and the machines and monitors don't work because of a cyber So that is a truly frightening prospect. And that's why I think you're right. We have to take this all very seriously.
All right. Which brings me to the question of ethics. And this is something that you have spoken about regularly. But if we look at Russia, let's say, and perhaps China, North Korea, Iran, but certainly Russia, ethical behavior does not appear to apply. So how can you defeat an enemy like that and still behave ethically?
Well, we've all now got access to the same technology. So the potential methods that are open are common. You can look at the metadata of communications, whether telephones or internet or whatever. There's a lot of personal data that can be hoovered up, and indeed that's the business model of the internet is capturing all our personal data. So what distinguishes us is motive. And we have to believe this and believe it genuinely. We're defending our democracy and our values and our commitment to individual rights. If you take China, they're intent on using digital intelligence to control their population, and certainly a big chunk of their population in the weaker population. So I think it follows that we have to find ways to defend ourselves in ways that are consistent with our values. It would be a huge mistake to, as it were, go for the lowest common denominator. That's why in the 2016 Act that regulates this kind of activity by the British agencies, we've ended up with what we called the democratic license to operate. So places like GCHQ are told, here is your license to use these advanced tools, and here are the conditions that go with it. And you can summarize those conditions as the 3 R's. It's got to be done under the rule of law, domestic law. It's got to be regulated, so you've got oversight by judges and senior parliamentarians, and it's got to be done with restraint. So everything you do, you've got to think first, is it necessary to do this? And is it proportionate to the harm we're trying to prevent? And provided we apply those sort of very basic sort of ethical concepts, we can, I think, legitimately say we're operating with a democratic license. Parliament had a debate for about 1.5 years, quite an intense debate, I remember, and came up with something that got all party support. So I think we're on quite a good course there. Of course, you have to keep it up to date, and new technologies will be invented, no doubt. So Parliament will have to return at some point and update what they've done. Sure. But the basic principle, I think, is there. Whereas what I think we need to worry about are states where, as it were, the ruler simply sets the rules. Mm-hmm. And Russia is a classic example. Do whatever is necessary to defend the state.
Of course, that's very difficult to defeat.
Kind of activities that I think we shouldn't be engaging in.
Yeah, and just coming back into Europe, I mentioned Brexit earlier, and I know that in the run-up to Brexit, you were anxious about the security implications of the UK withdrawal from Europe. Now, the Foreign Secretary, talking recently, admittedly about business, said we need to take a 10-year view. But that seems to me to be a very long time in security terms. I mean, are you still anxious about the security implications of the withdrawal?
Yeah, well, I won't rehearse the arguments about Brexit itself. We've taken our decision. Our voice in the world has been diminished by Brexit. Maybe it will take 10 years for us to recover our place in the world. We have NATO, so in the defense world, we're still in a good place. We've got excellent bilateral relationships with countries like France and Germany, which we can develop even further. In the secret intelligence world, we shouldn't see any difference. because it was never a competence of the European Union. It's outside the Treaty of European Union. We can develop that through bilateral relationships, as indeed we were doing before Brexit. The tricky area, which is what I was referring to at the time, is really in law enforcement, where we're fighting criminality on both sides of the channel. Police services need to be able to exchange in near real time information, whether it's basic number plate, vehicle number plate and registration, or whether it's the DNA of convicted criminals or whatever it might be. And there were extremely good arrangements for that kind of transfer, so that police services around the UK could have that kind of access, including in Northern Ireland, working with the Republic, with the Garda in the Republic. Now we're outside the EU, so we're a third country. We can't be members of Europol in the old way. We can't be connected in the same way to all the information systems, the Schengen information systems. The agreement, which was eventually reached at the very last moment, does envisage that practical arrangements will be possible. I sincerely hope it will not take 10 years, because if it does, both we and our friends in Europe are going to find a really diminished law enforcement cooperation. It should be possible to work something out, but it ain't quite worked out yet, as far as I know. So it's going to take quite a lot of effort and work and goodwill. It's one of the reasons why, our attitude to Brexit should, really has to be cooperative with our European partners and not antagonistic. I have a side swipe in the book somewhere about the negotiating methods that were used. Dissing your opponents, Trump style, is not a sensible way to get to a long-term agreement.
Mm-hmm. So I think we've got to really watch this space then on that particular issue. But I think that much of what we're talking about this evening touches on resilience. And in your earlier book, Securing the State, you wrote about the need for coordination of government effort across departments. And you said that this means adapting government structures, the strengthening of the ability to provide strategic direction at the center of government, and breaking down departmental stovepipes, coupled with the decentralization of the detailed formulation of the policies and tactics to deliver the strategy based on the evidence and experience of those closest to the front line. And now that was pre-COVID. And I just wonder, in the light of COVID, what you think about that today. Are we seeing that route to resilience in action, or is there still work to be done?
I think there's a lot of work to be done. Some progress has been made. We have, for example, a National Security Council. Mm-hmm. When I was working in the Cabinet Office, we didn't. We've got a National Security Advisor, post just about to be taken up by a very experienced public servant. So that's on the positive side. I think we've probably got to say to ourselves, big national security problems are as likely to come out of natural hazards as hostile action. And if we apply our strategic notice and think ahead and identify some of the big issues that could come up, and then we can start, as you say, to build in more resilience. The good thing about investing in resilience, as we discovered when I was putting together the government's counterterrorism strategy contest, is that it's kind of multi-purpose. So if you have a telecom system that won't fall over at the first attack, you have a resilient system, and that's going to serve you well, regardless of what the form of disruption actually is. One of the things we did was buy a lot of decontamination suits of protective suits. Thankfully, that wasn't a way the terrorists chose to attack us. But those suits were jolly useful when it came to Salisbury and the Novichok attack. So the more resilient we are, the better. I would add one thought, which was very much part of our thinking when we put, after 9/11, the National Counterterrorism Strategy together, which is you want to secure things by design, not to have to bolt on security afterwards. So there's the slogan "secured by design" sort of took off, and new buildings now have in the City of London have regulations. You will find all sorts of protective security, but you don't notice. It's just part of the design. Nice example is the new American embassy in London, which is surrounded by a pond. You could not drive a truck bomb towards that embassy. It would sink to the bottom of the pond. But it just adds to the landscaping. Whereas the alternative, which is concrete blocks, barbed wire, armed guards, militarizes society. And I'm a great believer that the objective of national security planning is normality. And if you are forced into abnormal reactions, then you're not quite getting it.
Okay. And I just wonder, I mean, we're coming close to the end of our time, but I just wanted to go back to technology for a moment. And I think I'm right that you quoted Rand on one occasion about the spread of truth decay. And I just wonder, is there really such a thing as truth anymore? And how can truth decay be reversed?
Well, there are propositions which are empirically verifiable or contradictable. So you can have a hard fact which shows that that particular statement you've just made is factually wrong. The Trump inauguration was not the largest ever inauguration because the journalists have patiently counted the number of people there, and it's not. That's a verifiable statement, and it's been shown to be false. To deny otherwise and say, I have different facts, I have my own set of facts, is to veer off into irrationality. But then there are lots of statements which are not subject to that kind of truth, falsehood verification. So if I were to say, you are the finest interlocutor that I've had a conversation with, is that a true statement?
That's true, yes, I think, yeah.
I think it's true. But as it were, no matter how much evidence, you can dig up of other conversations that have been a complete disaster, it's still not proof in the same way. So we've got to be a bit careful. And obviously with the second class of propositions, people will take different views, and they're entitled to take different views because they weigh the evidence rather differently. But what the book is really about is this plea, for goodness sake, where you can conduct rational analysis, conduct it, and then take it seriously, and then understand your own demons, so you're not carried away by the passions of wanting to do something.
And there's a wonderful moment in the book, a slightly lighter moment, where you meet Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, and he looks at your shoes and says, you were in the military. And you turn that into an equation almost. I felt I was back in my maths class at St. Columb's College.
Yes, the example is there. And he said, I knew you were from defense or from the Foreign Office because you had shiny black brogues, and nobody else wears in Whitehall. They've all gone sloppy. And he was quite right. And it's a classic example of Bayesian inference, where you have a fact on the ground, the shoes, and you can use that to infer something about, as it were, what brought it about, which is my background in defense. And that is the approach. When new evidence arrives, such as the shiny shoes, you should use it to alter your degree of belief that you had before. This is just an ordinary civil servant. This is now a civil servant from defense. You've used that information. And that's, of course, how we get machine learning. That's the principle behind artificial intelligence programs and all the rest of it. That's the future, which is why I rather cheekily put a little equation in the book. My editor did warn me it does reduce sales if people see there's an equation in the book, but it's a very simple one, and it's actually fundamental to a lot of today's world.
So David, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and tremendously interesting to hear what you've had to say. And I know that our audience will be very grateful to you for giving us the time this evening. So it only remains for me to say thank you very much, and to say thank you also to our audience for tuning in, and to say to them that I hope they will now go and buy this really excellent book. And I hope sincerely that it won't be too long, Sir David, before we can welcome you back to St. George's House in person. But from St. George's House online tonight, let me just say, keep safe, keep well, and good night.
Good night, Kay.